The Dharma, incomparably profound and exquisite, is rarely met with even in hundreds of thousands of millions of kalpas. We now can see it, hear it, accept and hold it. May we realize the true mind of the Tathagata. Today is the seventh and final day of this 7-day sesshin here in June 2022 at Mountain Gate in northern New Mexico. And I'd like to share with you another koan. As you know, the koans have come into being, actually, for centuries, since a long time ago in China. And they are used to help us expand and deepen our opening, or even trigger an opening, into a deeper, more profound experience of life and perception. So the koan I'd like to share with you today is number 16 in the Mumonkan, and it is called, get this light over here, When the Bell Sounds. And I'm sharing today from a book called Two Zen Classics. There are a number of translations and commentaries on the Mumonkan, almost nothing on the Hekigan-roku, which is the other most popular koan collection in use these days. But you can find many different commentaries and translations. The ideal one, from my perspective, is one from quite a long time ago at this point, but contemporary, a Japanese roshi, Zenkei Shibayama, who was a deeply realized and highly respected Japanese roshi, who was also fluent in English. And so if you can only get one copy of the Mumonkan translations, Gateless Gate, get his. There are other translations by Robert Aiken Roshi, by Konyamada Roshi, and then this one, which actually includes both the Mumonkan and the Hekigan-roku, by Katsuki Sekita, another Japanese. And here is how the koan reads. Umon, who was a great Chinese Zen master, Yunmen in Chinese, said, "The world is vast and wide. Why do you put on your 7-piece robe at the sound of the bell?" The world is vast and wide. Why do you put on your 7-piece robe at the sound of the bell? You see, I come in the morning for chanting in what's known as a kesa. That is the outer, most formal robe in Rinzai Zen, and that's what is being responded to here. So when the bell rings, and the bell will ring at Sogenji, we don't ring a bell here, but basically because we don't have a bell to ring. But there is a bell that's rung every morning at just before 4 o'clock in the morning at Sogenji, announcing the beginning of the morning sutra reading. And the women come from the women's zendo, and the men come up from the zendo proper, where they stay as well. And then the roshi comes, and we are all seated in the hondo and do an hour of chanting every morning. The roshi in his 7-piece robe, and all of us who are ordained also in our formal robes as well. So why? The bell rings, why don't you just roll over and go back to sleep? When I was at the Rochester Zen Center, somehow there never seemed to be an opportunity to have private time. It almost became comical. unlike perhaps some other folks, I was not unused to this situation because growing up in my household of origin, I also had no private time. If I wasn't doing something, I was told, "What are you doing?" And if I said nothing, then I was told that something would be found for me to do. So never was I able to have any private time. Uh, and I kind of got used to it, even though it wasn't pleasant. Uh, it didn't seem quite fair, but uh, then when I got to the Rochester Zen Center, it was just more of the same, although not with malevolent intent. And that was something that was a clear distinction for me. I understood that all that was being asked in the interest of my and everyone else at the center. And there were about 35, 36 of us back then living at the Rochester Zen Center, to help us let go of our attachments, in particular our attachments to what we felt like we needed to have to be happy and fulfilled. There's a very fine line here. It was not abusive. And that is important to recognize. Zen training was back then, with Roshi Kapleau in charge, was sort of modeled after Milarepa and his what he underwent under Marpa's direction. If you remember the story of Milarepa, Milarepa was a very young when his father died, and his father left the family finances, which were ample apparently, in the hands of an uncle, a relative. And rather than using them to support Milarepa's mother and his sister and himself, the uncle made them slaves in his own household and used the money for his own ends. And this began to create a great deal of resentment in Milarepa's mother. And so she urged him, as he grew older, to become apprenticed to someone who practiced dark magic, black magic. And so he learned how to do black magic, which is creating negative events. And he did. He managed to create an out-of-season snowstorm that destroyed the harvest for the area and caused a great number of deaths from starvation. He also, at the behest of his mother, when there was a great accumulation of relatives in the family house, he caused the central column holding up the roof to collapse, and it killed something like 24 people. So he had some pretty negative karma. He wasn't exactly happy about this. He didn't 100% share his mother's view. And so he was filled with remorse and sought out Marpa, who was a spiritual teacher. Marpa initially refused to teach him. Understanding his past, questioning as well whether he would actually be willing to do the work that's necessary to become free. And so he set about asking him to do a number of stringent tasks, building houses. He said, "Build me a house here." And their only thing to build in Tibet was stones. So Milarepa labored extensively building a house. And when it was finished, called Marpa over to see it. And Marpa said, "Actually, I don't want it here. Move it over there." And so he had to take the whole thing down and rebuild it in a different location. 3 times Marpa did this. And then furthermore, he actually had instructed Milarepa to build a tower in a very dangerous part of Tibet. At which point, Marpa's wife took pity on Milarepa. He's just a young kid. Why do you do all this to him? Why don't you just teach him? He wants to be taught. Why don't you just teach him? And so Marpa said, all right, I will do that, but understand that he still has extremely negative karma that has to be expiated in order for him to become free. So that will still have to be done, but I will teach him. And so he did teach him, and Milarepa ended up becoming a highly accomplished, deeply realized human being who's very famous for his spiritual poetry. And he's well known even to this day, partly because of his strenuous training, and partly because of his deep realization that came as a result of his dedication. I've mentioned before that at the Rochester Zen Center, there was a hut around behind the garage where garden tools were stored. It was called Milarepa's hut. And Roshi Kapleau's way of training us was not so different from Marpa's, although we didn't have to go out and build houses of stones, but we had long hours of work, and often he would choose to change his mind on what was done when it was almost finished. There's the famous experience when we were scheduled to have a ceremony. I don't remember anymore what the ceremony was, but there was a question about whether it would be held in the zendo or in the hondo, which was we called the Buddha hall. And there weren't enough mats and cushions to be both places at the same time. So we hauled all the mats and cushions from the zendo and set them all up appropriately in the Buddha hall. And then Roshi was called to come and inspect, and he said, actually, I think we should really have that ceremony in the zendo. So we reversed process and set it all up in the zendo. And then again, everything was transported back to the Buddha hall again. And I don't remember anything much more than that, other than the fact that I recognized that I was not going to have a chance for a nap. And we were getting so close to the opening time for the ceremony that wherever they were at that last point is where they were going to be. In those early days, I was annoyed. And there were times when I tried to get away for a weekend. But somehow, most curiously, every time I tried to get away for a weekend, and I actually owned a house on the outskirts of Washington, D.C. at the time, which was only, I can't remember, it was a drive from Rochester, but it was drivable. And at the time, it was no one was renting it, so I had to deal with it. And there were some repairs that had to be made as well. So I wanted to go down and do that. But every time I wanted to do that, basically I wanted to flee. The house was an excuse. Then something happened. There was a ceremony, or an additional sitting, or something always came up to the point where I just threw up my hands and laughed, because it just wasn't going to happen. I was going to be in that environment with things having to be done, whether I was fond of having them to be done or not. And gradually over time, it was interesting. One year, many years later, Bowden, who had been one of Roshi's attendants on one of his periods of time in Mexico, said to me, you know, when I realized I never was going to have personal time, all of a sudden it was okay. Why, at the sound of the bell, do you put on your 7-piece robe and go to the zendo and do the chanting service? Why don't you just do what you feel like you want to do? After all, if you're so free. The thing about the kind of freedom that we open to in Zen practice is it is the freedom to be free even in the midst of the most challenging circumstances. And here I pull out my two favorite people, Shirobu-nan, who was accused of fathering a child that he did not father, and forced to raise that child for a year before the girl who his mother, the child's mother, admitted who the father was, and how easily he went about it, how simply he responded to the situation, not finding any anger anywhere, simply being so free that he could empathize with the plight of the grandparents, and the girl too, for that matter. And then a year later, the same thing, when they came terribly embarrassed at the trouble they'd caused him for that year to get that baby back. That is freedom. That's the only real freedom. What Jacques Lutheran found in Buchenwald, when he finally let go of his felt need to have things a certain way in order to be happy, was freedom, real freedom. And in the midst of that, he found joy. Zen training is a challenge. Even at Sogenji, long hours of sitting, no personal time. By then I was accustomed to that, so that was not a problem. There was only the choice between taking a 5-hour nap or brushing your teeth. And yet the depths one could go in one's practice was phenomenal. And the freedom one could realize was equally phenomenal. We come to Zen practice with some sense that this can happen. And of course, it's not that easily won. There's a lot we have to let go of that interferes with our experiencing that freedom in order to experience it. Roshi Kapleau once said to me, you know, people come for training at the Rochester Zen Center and they all say, Roshi, don't hold back. I want to train deeply. Give it to me. He says, but if you do that, they don't like it. It doesn't work. Still, even if one isn't strict in the training of people, there arise resentments, rejections, wishes that it be different, irritation, annoyance, and all of that. But each one of these actually is a Dharma gate. A Dharma gate is an experience that is right in front of your face, that is notable in its impact on you, such that you're willing to really take a look. And through that Dharma gate, you can open to freedom from whatever it is. And this is not denial. This is not fleeing from reality. This is in the midst of that challenging mind state to go deep into that inner sensation in your body, searching for the source of it, searching for who is that's feeling this. And as we continue this process, no matter where we are, whether we're in training at a Zen center or out in the world, we can reach a place through diligent work, committed work of true freedom. So that even in the midst of a challenging situation, we can be free. Now, it requires some level of discernment as well. If you're in a work situation, for example, where things are extreme, perhaps even dangerous, then you want to take a look. Feel out. Don't think out, feel out how it really feels. Is this really going to be working for you? Or is it something that is more appropriate to leave? Dangerous situations are not particularly helpful ordinarily. Of course, Shirobu Nan's Dharma successor, who was Hakuin's teacher, the old man of Shoju Hermitage, used to sit in the village graveyard with the wolves breathing down his neck. He could feel their hot breath and hear him sniffing around his ears. That was testing his degree of focus and degree of freedom also. There are stories of monks who sat naked in bamboo groves, which are infamous for their floods of mosquitoes. And different situations like that. Those are people testing themselves. But if we're in a day-to-day environment that is dangerous, that is causing us severe stress, it's worth looking into it and seeing if really that's appropriate to be there. Discernment is an important aspect of Zen practice. I think about a woman who was a student of Mitra-roshi's, I believe, who had an awakening experience, and she decided to test it, this openness that she was experiencing, by going into a seedy hotel in a bad part of San Francisco. The result was that she had to jump out a second-story window to avoid being accosted by two men. It's a true story. You don't need to go that far. In fact, what that says to me is that her awakening experience was not deep enough to allow that discernment. You have to use your sense. But when it comes to Zen practice, assuming you're in a legitimate place of practice where it's not abusive, and I think about the Rochester Zen Center here too, or Sogenji, then you're going to bump into all kinds of places where you're caught, and it is a wonderful opportunity to reach in and stay tuned into what's going on in your body and explore it and gradually become free of being caught in whatever that is that you thought you needed to have. Like Bowden said, once I realized I had no personal time, there was no longer a problem. He is now the abbot of Rochester Zen Center and has been since 1986. So it's a balance But unless we bump into our stuff, we have no chance of becoming free. Why, at the sound of the bell, do you put on your 7-piece robe and go into the zendo and chant? Because you're free to do that freely without being caught in any ideas about what you want to do or what you don't want to do. It needs to be done, and you do it. It's a place of deep freedom. And when you have that level of freedom, you can be in any circumstance, and it's not a problem. Our Zen practice, if we really go at it as thoroughly as possible, as deeply as possible, will bring us to that place. It's not going to be instantaneous, and be warned that in order to become free of where we're caught, most of the time, not all the time, but most of the time, we actually have to encounter the caughtness in order to work with it to become free. So on this final day of sesshin, there are only a few hours left. Take your practice to a deeper level. Sink in. You are so much more open now than you were even a few hours ago, much less at the beginning of sesshin. Take advantage of that. It will be so worth it. I thank you for listening. We'll stop now and recite the 4 vows.